Good evening, everyone. I'm Archit Seshadri. Thanks so much for watching Gravitas right here on WION. Tonight, we take a look at the U.S. and China's relationship as U.S. President Donald Trump and China's leader Xi Jinping get ready to meet in the state of Florida. We'll also dive in on controversial ads around the world. This after Pepsi pulls back an ad featuring Kendall Jenner. But first, some breaking news coming in that we're going to get to right now from the U.S. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes will temporarily step aside from an investigation into Russian meddling into last year's election, including interactions between Moscow and the Trump campaign. Let's take a look at why Nunes had to step aside. The move comes as the House Ethics Committee announced it's investigating, as well as allegations about Nunes that he may have mishandled classified information. Nunes may have also made unauthorized disclosures violating House rules and the law. With the Ethics Committee now formally involved, there really was no way that Nunes could oversee the Russia probe, although he will continue as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee.
I recently confirmed that on numerous occasions, the intelligence community incidentally collected information about U.S. citizens involved in the Trump transition. Details about U.S. persons associated with the incoming administration, details with little or no apparent foreign intelligence value, were widely disseminated in intelligence community reporting.
Well, the departure of Nunes comes on the heels of the exit of White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon from the National Security Council, almost 24 hours, in fact. Bannon had come under the lens of Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who reportedly found that his desire to deconstruct the government was hurting the president. Bannon, it appears, was closely monitoring National Security Advisor McMaster too closely for his own good and therefore had to go. All right, let's now go straight to the United States where Glenn Carl, former intelligence officer, is standing by. Glenn, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Quite a bit of a shakeup there with the White House. Before we get to our big discussion with regards to this, two different people from Trump's team and now sort of taking a step back. What do we make of this with Donald Trump's sort of a shaky administration? Glenn.
Well, Steve Bannon is, in his philosophy, fundamentally un-American, to be honest about it. And a large majority of Americans recognize this. And he's been creating, by his sincere beliefs, which Trump has followed, since Trump largely doesn't have concrete beliefs, he has postures, has been creating problems for Trump. So it's a step towards rationality to the extent that it removes a subversive, frankly, element in the National Security Council, utterly lacking professionalism. So that's one thing. Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, has stepped aside also. And in a sense, you could say that's a positive statement, at least, or a step, at least it recognizes the utter compromise that Nunes has done to himself by shilling for the White House in the investigations of the president's associations with Russia, rather than conducting an impartial investigation. But the two men replacing him were champions of the Benghazi Committee, which itself was clearly nothing but a political hatchet job against Hillary Clinton. So is it from the frying pan to the fire? I don't know, but each step in a minor sense is a positive one towards rationality.
All right, Glenn, thank you so much for that. We'll continue having you stay for the rest of the discussion. But right now, let's dive into our first segment, U.S. and China's relationship. U.S. President Donald Trump and China's leader Xi Jinping start a two-day summit in Florida at a resort. is going to start momentarily. Trump is concerned about the multi-billion-dollar trade deficit with Beijing, as well as North Korea's muscle flexing. Well, Xi Jinping, well, he'll be looking to reorder a major power relationship. WION's Manoj Kevaldramani reports.
China's President Xi Jinping begins his first summit with US President Donald Trump in Florida later on Thursday. The backdrop is not very encouraging. 60% of Americans distrust him, according to a new Pew opinion poll. 36% see him primarily as a military threat, and 58% would back the use of force against China if it attacks an Asian ally. Then there is North Korea's muscle flexing and missile testing. Trump had earlier this week threatened to go it alone to contain Pyongyang, accusing Beijing of not doing enough. It's a charge that the Chinese vehemently deny.
中国长期以来为解决半岛问题做出了巨大的努力，发挥了重要的作用。那么半岛问题由来已久，要从根本上解决问题，必须标本兼治、综合施策、全面平衡地解决各方的合理关切。
Beyond Pyongyang, Trump and Xi are also expected to discuss regional security issues such as the South China Sea dispute and the deployment of the THAAD missile system in South Korea. But perhaps the biggest sticking point between the two will be trade. America's trade deficit with China stands at a whopping $347 billion US. Trump has promised to address that, but there is yet no plan in place to do so. Trump had earlier threatened to label China as a currency manipulator and slap 45% import tariff on Chinese goods. But all this bluster has so far not led to any action. In contrast to all the tough talk, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's visit to Beijing last month ended with him defining Sino-US ties using phrases like non-confrontation, mutual respect and win-win solutions, which was straight from Beijing's playbook. It's the kind of language that Barack Obama had refrained from, and this may perhaps give Xi hope that for all the assertiveness on Twitter, Trump might actually be the US president to acknowledge Beijing's narrative of building a new type of major power relationship. Manoj Kevaldramani, WION.
All right, joining me to discuss this section, let's introduce the guest tonight on Gravitas here in the studio in New Delhi. We have Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, a former High Commissioner to the UK. We also have also joining us from Delhi, we have Madhav Nalapat, a foreign affairs commentator and a China specialist, of course, from the United States. We have Glenn Carl, who joins us, a former intelligence officer from Beijing. We have Einar Tangen, who advises the Chinese government on developmental issues. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, I want to go to former Ambassador Mukherjee right here in the studio. Shiv Shankar, China is the most trusted country in the United States. The United States and China's relationship, how important is that relationship going forward, especially during the Trump era?
You know, it's sometimes a little difficult to talk about relationships, you know, at the level of the people and at the level of governments. Certainly, you can have a poll where China seems to be distrusted by a vast majority of Americans. But the fact remains that the relationship with China is fundamental to America's trade, and similarly for China. So these are, as your leader mentioned, your headline. These are, I think, this is probably the most important meeting that one can think of between two world leaders today. One is the sole superpower of the world. Regardless of the, you know, what the world is looking at, and almost a kind of unpredictable, dysfunctional kind of functioning of the US government under President Trump, the fact is, it is the sole superpower of the world. China is an emerging, well, China is virtually in that league itself, and certainly in that league in terms of its economic might. The two have problems. You know, at the present moment, North Korea looms large. Accusations from the Americans about China not doing enough.
Right.
The Chinese, of course, frightened that if they do what the Americans and others expect them to do and lean very hard on North Korea, they might, that state might just collapse and they'll be faced with millions of refugees in their own country. So they don't want that kind of outcome. There's the trade issue, there's the North Korean issue, and there's, of course, huge political issues such as the freedom of the seas, China's claim on the South China Sea, the Americans have walked out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Chinese are pushing their version of the partnership in the oceans, which, you know, on the Pacific fringe, which the TPP was supposed to be.
Right.
So you can see that in terms of the impact on Asia as a whole and on the world as a whole, I really can't imagine a meeting that's actually more important.
And let me also ask you, you know, very interesting that Trump is going to meet with his Chinese counterpart in Florida at a golf resort as opposed to meeting in Washington, D.C. I mean, is that symbolic? Is that interesting? Can we draw any inferences on what to expect given that choice of location, or is that just maybe to sort of change the mood a little bit? Shiv Shankar?
Well, there has been talk that there may have been some kind of disappointment in China that this visit was not being treated as a state visit, being hosted at the White House. But obviously, there, you know, diplomatic contacts may have, and there have been reports about the son-in-law of the president, Jared Kushner, having successfully negotiated the golf resort at the venue. I don't think that's going to, you know, that we can attribute any great significance to that. Obviously, the Chinese have agreed to it, but a little bit of speculation will be attracted to this, because the atmospherics of a visit are extremely important to China always. I remember when the president, the Chinese leader was supposed to come to America during Bill Clinton's time.
Right.
They had insisted that, and Clinton was to return the visit, they had insisted that he would have to stay at least 11 days, which is what the Chinese leader at that time had spent in America. And the statement that was actually, communicated to the State Department and even in the public domain from China was that a great power must be treated with respect. But having said that, I doubt if there's been any there probably was from President Trump underlining the fact that, you know, this is the place he would feel much more comfortable in.
And real quickly, a last question to you, Mr. Shiv Shankar Mukherjee. The personalities between these two leaders, very different, both different types of experience, different types of personas. How can we draw upon that or infer upon that from two of the most powerful world leaders, the U.S. and China at this point, Trump and Xi Jinping?
Xi Jinping is going to America, having been recently anointed as the core leader of China, which is the kind of title that I think was last given to Mao Zedong. And that obviously means that his control over the all-powerful Communist Party apparatus is complete. So he's going as an extremely strong leader. And on the other side, there is you know, a certain aura of unpredictability.
Which we've seen already in
a certain amount of role reversals. I mean, you have America walking out of the Paris Agreement and walking out of its position as a global leader of things that need to be done to fix the world, like the environment. And China moving into that position, spending hundreds of billions of dollars and cleaning up its Energy Act. So it will really be very interesting to see what is the outcome of such a meeting. I mean, who comes out what will we see when the two leaders have a joint press conference or in the joint statement? You know, it'll be very, very interesting to see who is the leader in terms of, you know, the outcome.
Right, who will dictate the conversation, who will have the final word.
Looking like the leader of the world.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you so much, Mr. Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, for your perspective. We appreciate that. With that, let's actually listen in right now to how Trump described China.
I'm going to instruct the United States Trade Representative to bring trade cases against China, both in this country and at the WTO, World Trade Organization. China's unfair subsidy and its behavior is prohibited by the terms of its entrance into the WTO, and I intend to enforce our rules. Number 5, I'm going to instruct my Treasury Secretary to label China a currency manipulator, which should have been done years ago.
Let me now go to Einar Tangen with regards to this discussion. What about China and all of this? Is this all about Xi Jinping solidifying his position at home?
Well, yes, and this is a very important year for Xi. Obviously, later this year, there will be a discussion about the succession process. Obviously, he's looking to press forward on what he thinks are the most important items on China's agenda, which, quite frankly, is avoiding the middle income trap. A lot of that is going to depend on getting a hold of, current issues here. A lot of state-owned enterprises, overcapacity, debt. These are all issues on China's radar. Now, quite frankly, they're trying to deal with it. And a lot of people see that as a weakness. They say, oh, China's slowing down. But if you take a look at the nuanced view, you'll see that they are making allowances to move from their investment-driven to this consumption-driven economy. So I think they're taking care of what they're trying, what is necessary. The difficulty is Trump. You have kind of, on one hand, chaos, which is his way of dealing with things. There's no trade policy. There's no domestic policy that have been enunciated. His staffing is in disarray, under attack, incomplete. His polling is just abysmal. He suffered major defeats. So it's very hard for the Chinese.
All right, let's go to Glenn Call with regard to some of those comments and the sort of reaction with regards to that. What exactly do we believe that Trump hopes to achieve through this summit? Is this sort of just his, working and weaving his way around foreign policy, something that he doesn't really have a whole lot of experience with in politics in general? Glenn.
Well, we can't expect him to hope to achieve anything concrete because, as the gentleman speaking just before me said, that he has no coherent policy. A French philosopher said that no wind will serve a ship that has no destination in mind. He has visceral nationalism as an emotional posture reflex, and that's about it. And then he's issued totally contradictory statements on we can cut a deal, we will be tougher. But he has no policies, true policies with regard to trade or North Korea or the South China Sea or the largest issue of all. The first speaker pointed out clearly, the most important meetings that can occur in the world are between the Chinese leader and the American leader right now. And it's not just current importance. The global order is changing. China is becoming the superpower or a superpower. The international order that's existed for 70 years no longer obtains. And the two nations that will shape it the most are China and the United States. And all we have is Trump with visceral nationalism that in fact is self-defeating. It's almost a terrifying prospect because North Korea could easily become a shooting situation,
right.
And so could the South China Sea, and on and on. So it's quite alarming. There is no coherent policy or any thoughts that are detectable.
All right, let's now go straight to a WION newsroom where we have Ramesh Ramachandran standing by, our correspondent, to talk about this. Ramesh, I know you've covered a whole host of issues when it comes to the MEA, specifically on India and a lot of South Asian issues. With regards to this meet with Trump and China, Xi Jinping, I mean, this is a very crucial meeting, a host of issues to be discussed. Trade, North Korea certainly on the agenda, and generally the U.S.-China equilibrium. How important is this meeting in your opinion, especially when it pertains to Asia?
Absolutely, Archit. As Ambassador Mukherjee said a short while ago, trade, North Korea, South China Sea could be some of the issues that are likely to figure in the discussions when the two leaders meet in Florida just a short while from now. That said, now Trump has already tweeted in the run-up to the talks that the talks are going to be a difficult one. He did not mince words and say that we can't have massive trade deficits or job losses. Now, that said, this will be essentially a get-to-know kind of a meeting, a summitry between the two leaders who have never met in their respective presidencies so far. But from India's perspective, India will be looking to at the outcome or deliverables from the summit, especially the joint statement that will be issued towards the end of the Xi-Trump talks. Now, from India's perspective, remember in 2009, when Obama came to power, he talked about a G2, a US-China relationship. He talked about how the the China and US could, have a sort of modus vivendi on South Asia and allow China to have a suzerainty, as it were, over South Asian affairs, which MEA, the Indian establishment, didn't take kindly to. Remember, also, Obama began his presidency by not hosting the Dalai Lama, but towards the end of his presidency, he made more than amends for it by hosting the Dalai Lama in the White House. So, unlike Obama, Trump has been very inconsistent and contradictory, as Glenn pointed out just a short while ago. He began by talking about not adhering to the One China policy. He received a phone call from the Taiwanese president. Rex Tillerson spoke about not giving China access to the South China Sea Islands. But soon thereafter, we saw Trump going back or reneging on some of his remarks. So he's been very inconsistent in the last barely 100 days of his presidency. So that would be a cause of concern for India especially. Archit?
All right, Ramesh, real quick as well, I also want to jump in. We know Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, was in China not too long ago, prior to this meeting. I mean, it really seems like at this point, that meeting went neutral, I guess you can call it. There was really, it was more about diplomatic ties. But when it comes to, again, India, is there something in one way, shape, or form that India stands to either benefit or lose with regards to what happens with China and U.S.'s relationship? Ramesh?
Archit, a reading of the US-China relationship will be incomplete. It will not be complete without understanding the India-US dynamic under Trump going forward and the India-China dynamic going forward. So it will be a trilateral relationship, and a lot will depend on the interplay of these three countries in Asia and beyond. Now, let's remember, Trump is not as bullish as Obama on the so-called Asian pivot or Asian rebalance as Obama was. He's protectionist, he's isolationist, he's made contradictory statements on China. So a lot of gray areas there for India to overcome in the next few weeks or months going forward. So all eyes will be on the joint statement and what the devil is in the detail, as they say. So India will be looking to read and interpret the joint statement for symbols or signals as to how the US-China relationship can be expected to go forward. Archit? All
right, Ramesh, I'll have you stand by there for a second. Let's now go to Mr. Madhav Nalapat. He is a professor joining us. Thank you again for your time. I want to ask you about this with regards to this meeting. Do we expect China's leader to announce maybe some sort of a $1 billion investment in the U.S. perhaps? He's done so in other countries recently. What do we expect China's leader to sort of walk away from this meeting with Trump?
Well, I'd like to point out that if you look at Donald Trump, he's talking about America first. If you look at Xi Jinping, he's talking about China first. This is the most assertive leader China has ever seen since Mao Zedong. And the question is, can America first coexist smoothly with China first? So quite frankly, in this match, one or the other participant is going to walk away feeling belittled, and the other participant is going to walk away having got something extra. Both cannot win together. It cannot be, as the Chinese say, a win-win situation given the personalities and the policies of these two people. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Trump, inconsistency, chaos, etc. I mean, to my way of looking, Trump has a consistent policy based on his business acumen. Today, the trade between the United States and Asia is about 3 times that between the United States and its trading partners in Europe. Today, it's no longer the Atlantic century. It's going to be the Asia-Pacific century. That means that Germany and France will have to give way, and you'll have to give way to Japan and India. So there's no wonder Germany, France, the UK, the Atlantic establishment are still putting a lot of emphasis on Russia. Russia as the enemy, because Russia as the enemy suits the Atlanticists. China as the rival will be more of the Indo-Pacific situation.
Right.
So I don't believe there's any doubt in my mind there's an inevitable drift towards China as a strategic rival of the United States, which it is. Whether you look at North Korea, whether you look at the Middle East, whether you look at Africa, whether you look at Latin America, the big challenge for US interests is not coming from Russia. It's coming from China. And from that point of view, the US, of course, is, as Rajesh said, is going to be dealing extensively with India. So I would like to say, one, in case Donald Trump follows the example of Rex Tillerson, frankly, Rex Tillerson in the summit with Xi Jinping was so charmed, He spoke almost like a foreign minister of China. The language used by Tillerson was identical to what the foreign minister of China would have said. Now, that may have given the Chinese an expectation that Trump is also going to bend over as much as the Secretary of State did. I'm not sure about that. In the next 48 hours, we'll know. But Trump cannot walk away from this looking weak on China, because China is such an important part of his foreign policy and his domestic economic policy.
All right, let me now go to Einar with regards to sort of on that, with regards to Trump's trade situation, the United States running a $300 billion trade deficit with China. I mean, with regards to power and strength, I mean, does that signify, one versus the other being more powerful? These are some of the most powerful leaders meeting at this golf resort for the next 2 days. Let's specifically talk about the trade aspect of this. Einar.
Well, in terms of trade, it's about a trade imbalance, $300 and some odd billion dollars that is currently there. So the question here is, how do you go forward? I have tremendous respect for my Professor Nalapat and his analysis, but I would beg to differ just a little bit, because quite frankly, the U.S. is creating the vacuum here. China is being thrust into the limelight somewhat hesitantly. After all, their political and economic system does not necessarily fit as a centralized economy the way that the rest of the world's economies go, including India. I think this is definitely not a situation which is going to be solely about China, but about Asia. And India is part of that. I think there should be more discussion and more talk about how all of these countries can work together, as opposed to seeing themselves as somehow being part or parcel of some war between the U.S. and China.
Right. Sort of as a China first or U.S. first, working collaboratively. Really quickly, Mr. Nalapat, would you like to respond? There was a little bit of a difference of opinion there. Would you like to respond to Einar?
Well, I'd like to point out, for example, that if you're looking at China as the main rival, it makes sense to extend a hand of friendship to Russia. Whereas to the Atlantic community, it's absolute poison that Russia becomes a friend, because then the value of Germany, the value of France as allies diminishes sharply. So there is this tremendous, portraying Moscow as the devil, but the reality today is Moscow is a third class or fourth class power. It's absolutely no threat to the United States, whereas China is a first class power. It's also a superpower and is definitely rivaling the United States. Let me end with North Korea. I believe, frankly, that the next 4 or 5 years, a situation will be reached in which North Korea will pose an intolerable and invulnerable threat to the United States, to Japan, to South Korea. Now, before that, action has to be taken. Either you give a chance to the Kim Jong-un, what I define as bright sunshine policy, and I would favor that. Give him every option to come to a peaceful settlement. But if he does not take it, in my view, kinetic action is inevitable. Otherwise, North Korea is going to become a cancer afflicting the entire world. So that's one cancer. Now, what is China going to do? They are never going to be on the same page as the US or North Korea. Now, regarding ISIS, for example, is a different matter altogether. And even there, you're seeing, in the case of Masood Azhar, for China, a terrorist is an individual who attacks China. Any other country like India, well, that's something which can be discussed and debated. So given this entire difference in worldview, I would be very surprised if Donald Trump were to follow the lead of Rex Tillerson and bend over backwards, forwards, and sideways the way Tillerson did to try and ingratiate himself with Xi Jinping.
All right, we're going to come to those points in just a short moment, North Korea, as well as the South China Sea dispute in a moment. But I want to go over to Glenn Carl in the United States with regards to a point that Mr. Nalapat just made about the difference in personality between Rex Tillerson, the meeting that took place in China, with what Trump's meet will be with Xi Jinping over the next 48 hours. Why is Trump's team, Glenn, for lack of a better word, sort of a short on talent? Does he not trust his diplomats, perhaps, in the State Department? And I mean, why meet at a golf course as opposed to meet at the nation's capital?
Well, the meeting at the golf course first, I think the answer for that is pretty straightforward, really. Trump does like pomp and circumstance, but he likes himself more than anything. And Mar-a-Lago, Trump's home in Florida, is where the meeting will occur, and so this is where he feels familiar and can glorify himself. Look, my home is the center of the world. I think it's as simple as that, and I think he would not be aware of how that could be a diplomatic slight and consequential to China or to another country. I think that's the case in that. Why is the administration thin? Because the things he says are almost consistently inconsistent and or incoherent,
right?
And extremist, and people on the left and right in the American political spectrum who are professionals and within several standard deviations of the norm will refuse to have anything to do with someone who seems to be incoherent, if not out of his senses, and potentially dramatically harmful to American and global interests. That's why you don't have people of talent who are willing to work for him. You have partisan zealots. I'd like to make a large point, I think, that might bring together potentially some of the comments that all of us have been making. There is a method to the madness, in a sense. As I said, Trump is a nationalist. He also de facto, more than implicitly, seems to recognize spheres of interest while being an isolationist. So that posture explains, in part, the rejection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an historic act by the United States to shape the global order that is emerging. The United States has walked away and surrendered this to Asia. That's of direct consequence to the globe, but also to India, because now that the United States has stepped back from that, and the Chinese alternative, which is much less rigorous and less impartial, will clearly dominate. Similarly, with Tillerson's comments, they did, as other commentators have mentioned, not just parrot, I think repeat verbatim the Chinese Foreign Ministry's policy lines, which the United States has explicitly avoided or rejected in previous years because it is a surrender to a sphere of influence, rise of China posture in the South China Sea and everywhere else in Asia and Southeast Asia. So this does seem to de facto be occurring, whether it's coherent and conscious on the part of Trump or not.
All right, let me now next go to Ramesh Ramachandran standing by in the newsroom. We have a few minutes left, so I want to sort of talk about the North Korea issue as well as South China Sea. Ramesh, with regards to North Korea, the issue of North Korea firing their missiles into the seas of Japan and South Korea, Trump has warned of retaliation and adding more pressure to China. China, though, has sort of said that, they don't really have as much control over North Korea as the U.S. believes and are worried that possible refugees could enter eastern China. So how is this whole Trump putting pressure on China with North Korea, how is all of this going to play out in the coming 48 hours, if at all? Ramesh?
Indeed, Archit, any escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula will have a direct bearing on India's national interests going forward. So to say that this is a far-off place in East Asia and India should not be bothered about what's happening on that peninsula would be, I would say, a bit, premature to say that. But that said, we've seen the heightened rhetoric in the past few weeks. North Korea going ballistic, literally and figuratively, and testing ballistic missiles, and South Korea has responded in the last 24 hours as well. So we've seen the escalation of tensions, especially given the fact that the U.S. missile defense system has been positioned on the South Korean on territory. So all this points to an escalation of tensions. Now, Trump and Rex Tillerson both have said that they don't have anything to add to what has already been said by the U.S. on its policy towards North Korea. But that said, Archit, I want to quickly add to one point which Professor Nalapart made. He talked about how China is a first-class power and Russia may be a third or fourth-class power. But I see a paradox there. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that if I'm Xi Jinping, I'd be sitting pretty today, given the U.S.-Russia bickering and the tensions between Trump and Putin, and how the U.S. establishment is pushing back at Putin and the Russian state, as it were. So I'm not sure how the dynamic of the U.S.-China relationship will pan out in the long term. given the fact that, as Professor Nalapart says, rightly says, that China is the immediate threat to U.S. But that said, if I'm Xi Jinping, I would still be predicting because of the U.S.-Russia tensions. But that said, another point to be considered here is that both leaders will be playing to their domestic constituents. Remember, it is a matter of prestige. They would be worried about, anxious about perception. So I guess both would be seeking to take something back to their to cater to their domestic constituents back home. Archit?
All right, let's now go to Mr. Nalapan back there with regards to the South China Sea issue. You know, China sort of being worried, a very frosty relationship, if you'd like to call China and the U.S.'s relationship. Specifically when it comes to the South China Sea, the U.S. adding a lot of pressure. Again, over the 48 hours, I'm sure these topics will be addressed, but to what extent will any of these decisions likely come forward?
Well, you know, as our American analyst correctly said, as Aina Tangen knows, I mean, the fact is that China would like to be, basically the primary power in Asia,
right,
because Asia is going to be the pivot of the globe. And from that point of view, it wants to control the South China Sea. If it does so, for India, Japan, ASEAN, all these countries are going to have to play a subsidiary role to China.
Right.
China is going to have its hand on the lever. It's not going to be the United States, it's not going to be European Union, it's going to be China. Now, can the US concede that? In my view, not at all. Can India or Japan concede that? In my view, not at all. Can ASEAN concede that? In my view, not at all. So this China first policy is creating a situation in which practically the entire eastern half of the continent is now finding itself at odds with some of the policies of China, most notably South China Sea. Lastly, the fact that so much of military hardware is coming into that sea makes the possibility of some kind of an inadvertent flare-up more and more likely. And where that flare-up will go, we do not know. As I said, I am not very optimistic that we can get through the next 3 or 4 years entirely without conflict.
All right, let me now go really quickly to Glenn Carl as we sort of wrap this discussion up, specifically about climate change. Trump has basically said that China sort of came up with climate change. It was sort of a ruse to, basically steal manufacturing from the United States and basically threatened to pull out of the Paris summit. So making certainly unpredictable statements. At this point, your sort of closing thoughts, your final thoughts with regards to Trump and China.
Well, I teach some university courses from time to time, and if a student shows a complete lack of competence, then you try to, or qualifications, you have them removed to take a remedial course. To assert, simply to appeal to a nationalistic and xenophobic electoral base that China has invented global warming, and that the entire National Academy of Sciences, the Environmental Protection Agency, NASA, and the CIA's scientists, and on and on and on, are a part of a global conspiracy is insulting and, if not intended to be insulting, insane. So it's a tremendous problem. I tried, the last point, 10 years ago when I was the National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats. These are global issues that cross borders.
Right.
I was supposed to analyze. I tried to have global warming, let's not call it climate change, which is a sop to those who deny it. It's the warming of the globe, to be the #1 crisis facing the United States and I think the globe. And I was not allowed to because we had to talk about terrorism all the time.
Right.
It is worse today. So for Trump to carry on this way is something of global concern.
All right. So we're going to wrap this up, and I'm going to start a little new thing that we're doing on Gravitas. 3 words on this topic. I'm going to go to all of our guests and our correspondent to sort of sum this all up. The Xi Jinping meet in the United States. 3 words. Let me first start with Ramesh. 3 words to talk about this. 3 final thoughts. Words.
3 words. Well, what can I say? Wait and watch.
All right. Wait and watch. All right. Let's go next to Mr. Nalapat. 3 words.
Well, my prediction would be a rocky start.
All right, a rocky start. All right, and Glenn, 3 words to sum all of this up between U.S. and China.
Apprehension, incompetence, change.
All right, apprehension, incompetence, and change. Well, thank you to all of our guests. That does it for this segment of Gravitas. A quick break right on this side. We'll be right back with more views.